Okay, we are recording. There. So, do what I usually do, remind us before announcements. Since it's not officially time to start yet, but yes, you can still retake exam 1 and 2, but only for practice. You can't do it to change your grade. You can still meet me online to get correct answers for exams 1 and 2 and get a 5% boost to your grade. Considering the overall averages of exam 2, I'm amazed more people have not taken me up on that offer. Get the correct answers for the final exam. Get your grade boost. As a whole, you guys need the grade boost. Same thing for exam 3. For the most part, those were really bad results. You can retake it until April 27th. And that date is a week before the final exam is due. That way, I'm cutting it off then. That way, you'll have that 1 week where, again, you can meet me online to get all the correct answers that you can use to study for the final exam. And of course, you get a 5% boost. And again, the results weren't very good for exam 3, just like exam 2. So hopefully, unlike exam 2, people will retake exam 3. There's nothing to lose. You can't go wrong, right? Your grade cannot get lower. So I highly recommend retaking exam 3. Just so you guys know, one person did score 100. I sat right here and watched them do it. So I can assure you it wasn't any kind of like cheating or anything like that. So it's possible. Anyway, any questions about the old exams? All right. It's 8 o'clock. All right. So even though this is online, I'll go ahead and start reminding you now. I'll probably do it every day, so I apologize in advance. The final exam will be on Monday, May 4th, from 8 to 9:15, right here in this room. It'll just be like the other exams, where you need to bring a charger, bring a computer, face that way, need to close the book, bring a calculator if you think you're going to need one, bring something to write with if you think you're going to need one. I'll provide scrap paper. But yeah, that's it. Oh, and just like the other exams, if you just don't want to come in Monday at 8:50 at 8 in the morning and whatever, just make arrangements with me and we can meet online, or we'll make other arrangements for you to meet before that, but not after. So yeah, make sure you're here for the final exam. Any questions about the final? And again, really quickly, I know I've said this before, but the final exam will be about 100 questions. About 50 of them will cover everything after exam 3, and about 50 of them will come from the first 3 exams. Anyway, this week is 100% virtual. It's an ecological footprint lab. Let me think. You got a video to watch with some questions to answer, an introduction to read, but there is no pre-lab. Otherwise, I would have reminded you last week. It's a pretty simple lab in my opinion, but nonetheless, we will not be meeting, but I will be available if you need me. So even though we're not meeting in person, I'm happy to meet with you if you want, or online. I can help you with that lab. You do not have to do it alone, even though it's 100% virtual. I can help you. I'm happy to help you. So any questions about lab this week? Okay, attendance, usual stuff. I'm going to say a bunch of attendance words. You're going to write them down. Take a screenshot when I say it, if you're, not in person. And then at the end of the video, again, if you're watching the video, like or comment on the video, take a screenshot of that as proof. And then, of course, one question about the material covered. Since the exam was so tough, and since it's a Monday for you, and since there's such a small crowd, you guys don't need to do anything. You can do all this and get extra participation points, but you've already got full credit because you're here. That's a concession, again, for the exam or for the fact that you're one of the few people here on a Monday. Anyway, the first question, or word for attendance, is not a word at all. It's just a question. The question is, where did you go this weekend? Nowhere. Friend's house, my parents' house, whatever. Short and sweet. Where did you go this weekend? All right. So let's talk about, let me back up. We are still talking about evidence of evolution. There we go. We're talking about evidence of evolution. We're talking about fossils as evidence, homologies. Now we're going to talk about, really quickly, biogeography. There's not going to be many questions about this on the exam, if any. The point is, we can look at how organisms are related, but also how they are geographically related as well. So take, for example, you can see here, South America, part of Africa, Australia, Southeast Asia. And we have this one particular flower that you can find in those areas. Even though they're far apart, they used to be together back when the continents were together. Because the continents are still moving. And there's been a few points in the history of Earth where the continents were together. Not just once either. So anyway, yep, that's more evidence of evolution. And if you want to, you can look into that for extra credit, right? Like, so what are some other examples? Not just plants, right? What are some examples of dinosaurs, for example? So there's fossils that we have found that you can only find in certain places, and they seem distant. But a long time ago, they used to be together. Sort of like the mountains that we live in and the mountains of Scotland. That used to be the same thing because those two continents used to be together. They crashed together against our mountains. Anyway, any questions about biogeography? That's it. Pretty simple. All right, let's talk about evolutionary trees. This is from the old textbook. There's probably not going to be any questions about this, but I wanted to bring it up anyway. So Darwin was the first to visualize the history of life as a tree with patterns of descent. So in other words, what I'm saying here is he was kind of the first person to look at all these different organisms and kind of visualize it like a family tree. People are used to seeing family trees. Like there's the great-great-grandfather, and there's the great-grandparents, and there's the, grandparents, so on and so forth. You're used to seeing that. But he was the first person to visualize all of life that way. So biologists still illustrate patterns of descent with evolutionary tree. But unlike when we're talking about, a family tree, usually for us, it's turned sideways. So I'm not going to ask you anything about that. So here's an example of a very, very basic evolutionary tree that deals with vertebrates. So these are all vertebrates. This is how all vertebrates are related. And you can see, again, I'm not going to ask any questions about this, but you might get some question where I say something like, if you were to get anything, I might give you a picture like this and say something like, all right, what's more closely related, ostriches and crocodiles, or crocodiles and mammals, right? You can just look like, all right, ostriches and crocodiles have a more recent ancestor than crocodiles and mammals, right? And it's be that simple. And the point is, like you can see here, that these little branching points, that's a common ancestor. Again, try to think of it like a family tree, right? So there was one common ancestor, and then gave birth, if you want to think of it like a family tree, to these two siblings, right? That's how you decipher it. So any questions about that? Okay. The evolutionary trees are hypotheses reflecting the current understanding of patterns of evolutionary descent. And some of them are based on convincing combination of all this evidence that we talked about previously, right? The fossils, the anatomical similarities, molecular data, right? But some of them are a little bit more speculative. With that being said, and again, I'll back up to what we just looked at. This isn't that speculative because here we're just talking about big picture, right? When I say we're talking, things are speculative, we're not looking at really big stuff like this. I'm talking about, for example, what Dr. Runke in our department does, and I've said this before, but he identifies new species of tapeworms. So, he's putting together these evolutionary trees and showing how they're related because he's the first person to discover them. So he's figuring them out. Anyway, any questions about that? All right, once again, I'll remind you these PowerPoints are based off of the old textbook. And the old textbook talked about this whale evolution thing. We skipped over that in one of the previous discussions when it was the process of science. Anyway, I'm going to skip over it again, so you can read about it if you want. There will be no questions about it in the exam. What I like about it, the old textbook, I like what they did because, like I said, they brought it up earlier in the chapter and said, hey, here's what they figured out about whale evolution back in the 70s. And then if you read this, if you download the PowerPoint, read it. Basically what they're saying is, once we got better technology and learned more things, they went back to the drawing board and said, okay, we were wrong previously. Now, here's what we know about whale evolution. I like that because that's just goes to demonstrate that science is not static, right? Science is constantly changing. We find out we were wrong, we admit we were wrong and move forward. We change what we say. Anyway, let's now get to this is a long chapter. We're kind of towards the middle here. Now that we're done talking about the background stuff, let's actually dig into natural selection. We're going to talk about natural selection as the mechanism for evolution. But before we talk about that, I just want to remind you, so you keep this in the back of your mind, natural selection is not the only way populations evolve, right? We're going to talk about natural selection a lot because that's the biggest way, but it's not the only way. And we'll talk about the other ways later. So here we go. Before we talk about natural selection, let's really quickly talk about artificial selection. And there will be a couple questions about this, at least one on the exam. Darwin figured that if artificial selection could make these changes that we see, right? Like look at these horses. That's the same species, right? We have one gigantic horse here, a tiny horse there. That's a huge difference, but that wasn't natural, right? That was humans breeding, right? Some humans bred a big horse because they wanted a big horse, right? So they going to make that big horse with this big horse. They did that for generations and generations. Of course, the opposite happened with a small horse. We've done that a lot. Like most of the vegetables and fruits you eat didn't look like that a long time ago, right? Humans have changed them with artificial selection. So basically, Darwin figured if we could do it, then surely nature could do it. And if we could study what we've done with artificial selection, then that'll help us understand how evolution works. Because artificial selection is a type of evolution. It's just not a natural thing, right? It's humans doing it. Artificial selection has two main components, and actually, if you're taking notes, you can take note this down too. These same two components are also the same two components that we need for natural selection. The first one is we have to have variation among individuals, which is why we go back to when we talk about mutations, right? I said mutations are important because without mutations, you wouldn't have evolution. And the reason is because of this bullet point right here. Without mutations, you would not have variations among individuals. So think about the peppered moth lab that you've already done. They were all just one color at first. So there was no variation as far as that phenotype is concerned. There was no variation. Then there was a mutation. And this one moth happened to have moth babies, little baby moths that happened to be black because of that mutation. Now we have this variation. In this particular case, that variation gave them an advantage. So they could survive longer. Therefore, they could reproduce in greater numbers. Therefore, they would pass along those genes more so than the white moths would. Which brings me to this second point, heritability. Right? So it's not enough just to have variation. That variation needs to be heritable. So I always get a little sad when I see, like, very rarely does it happen, but sometimes when people do that lab, they'll talk about, like, I ask the question, without the predators, would evolution still happen? Would the color still change? And sadly, some people do, yeah, because they got covered in soot. No, they didn't get covered in soot. They weren't dark because they were covered in soot. Everything else was covered in soot, and that gave them an advantage. So again, it's the heritability. So if they were covered in soot, right? Take a white moth, for example. If it was covered in soot, it would have an advantage, but it's not going to pass that advantage along because that was just it just got covered in soot. There was nothing heritable. So any questions about those two components? All right. Obviously, these are just pictures of watermelons. This is a picture from our labs. We work with watermelons here on campus. Again, same species, but there's variation. And that's another great example of artificial selection because watermelons used to just be one type of watermelon and they were really tiny and basically inedible. Not like dangerously inedible, but they weren't very pleasing. But then humans changed them over many years with artificial selection. Now we have all these different varieties. Any questions about that? All right. Say the next word for attendance will be later. But anyway, Darwin knew that individuals and natural populations have small but measurable differences. It's the variation we talked about, right? But what he didn't know was the force that determined which individuals made it, right? So again, in his mind, he's kind of comparing artificial selection to natural selection, right? So with artificial selection, we know who's in charge is humans, right? Humans are trying to make a bigger horse or a smaller horse or a meaner dog or whatever it may be. You choose those traits. But he's saying in nature, he didn't at first realize, how were these decisions, so to speak, being made? But that brings us to Malthus. There's a documentary I want to share with you guys. Hopefully I get it soon. I want to make some questions for it. That way you guys can get extra credit for watching it. But anyway, this documentary talks about Darwin and his trip. And it mentions how he studied this guy named Malthus. And Malthus contended that human disease, famine, and war were a consequence of human populations increasing faster than food supplies and other resources. Of course, that's pretty basic and oversimplified. Really, when you think about it, that's not 100% true, but largely it is, right? So Darwin applied these concepts, right? So he thought, okay, well, if that's true for humans, what about other animals, right? What about plants? What about other organisms? So he reasoned that resources in any given environment are limited, and the production of more individuals in the environment can support leads to a struggle for existence. Know that one. I'm pretty sure there's a test question about that. And only some offspring survive in each generation. So these are all, again, things that you need for natural selection, right? These are all what the basics, right? You have to have these things for natural selection to happen. If resources were not unlimited or were unlimited, there wouldn't be really a struggle for existence. And it's kind of hard for humans to think about that, at least us, right? Because generally speaking, we're not struggling to survive, right? We can generally eat when we want to, drink when we want to. We generally get health care, right? But for natural populations, it is a struggle to survive. Every little thing is a struggle. Like, I don't know, I was just thinking about hummingbirds the other day. I don't know why. But you have to think about, like, their ability to hover gives them the ability that no other bird has, so they can collect nectar, right? Because they can hover. And that gives them an advantage because that nectar is high in glucose, right? High in sugar, which is good for calories, good for making ATP, right? But on the other hand, think about how many calories they burn hovering, right? So there's this real big, not big, excuse me. I haven't had on my coffee yet. It's a balance, right? Everything's a balance, right? One thing sets off another. It's very economical. Anyway, any questions about this slide before we move forward and talk more about this idea of reproduction? All right, specifically unequal reproduction. So individuals whose traits are better enable them to survive and reproduce more successfully, they pass those traits down, right? This is what adaptation is, right? So if there's something that gives them an advantage, like those black moths, right? They had an advantage. So because of that, they were more likely to survive. And because of that, they were more likely to reproduce. That is basically adaptation. So again, like I said earlier, we're still talking about what Darwin was thinking, how he came up with natural selection. And he figured that if artificial selection could bring big changes in a relatively short time, then natural selection could surely do it, right? So if humans could do it so quickly, surely nature can do it over hundreds, thousands, millions of generations, really. So again, it's very important to understand we're talking about reproduction. This is why I don't like the term survival of the fittest when they talk about natural selection. The survival is only half of it. If you're not reproducing and passing along those traits, that's not natural selection. And good on you for surviving, but you're not changing the population. It's all about reproducing. So anyway, any questions about that slide? All right, that was almost the introduction. Now we're going to talk a little bit, dig even deeper. We're going to talk about natural selection in action. Then I give you some key points about natural selection that you'll know for the exam. Now, if I want you quick, let me know when I'm trying to go quick, because we're running short on time this semester. So evolutionary change has been documented, right? So it's not like Darwin figured it out, let me just stop talking about it and stop studying it, right? He figured it out, and then a lot of other people started studying it. Like, again, the pepper moths, for example, right? Kettlewell was one of those people who studied them. So it's been thousands of people who studied it in different ways. One unsettling example of natural selection is pesticide resistance. And this goes back to that picture that I showed you in the very first slide of this chapter with the kid scratching his head. And we were talking about head lice. That is an insect, so that does fall under this idea of pesticide resistance. So let's talk about it. So what happens is, basically, you spray the field or your head, whatever the case may be. You lay down the pesticides trying to kill these pests. And what happens is you kill all the weak ones, right? Most of them die. But there might be some of them that have something in their genome that allows them to survive the pesticide, right? So they're not susceptible to that pesticide. So now you've killed off this whole weak population, and now only the strong have survived. And those are the ones who are going to reproduce. So then once they reproduce, this next generation and the subsequent generations after that are going to be resistant to the pesticide, right? So you created basically a super insect. And also the same thing can be said for antibiotics. And I think this is a slide at the end of the chapter or end of this PowerPoint that talks about that too. But that's just why when you go to the doctor, they say they give you 10 days of antibiotics. They say, make sure you take all 10 days. Like a lot of people make the mistake of taking the antibiotics, and once they start feeling good, they stop taking them. But what's happened is you take the antibiotics, we'll kind of use this picture, even though those are supposed to be insects or bugs, whatever. You can see here that we're looking at one particular chromosome, one gene, right? And there's two different alleles, a red allele and a green allele. And whatever it is about the red allele makes those insects resistant to the pesticide. So in a sense, you could think the same thing about bacteria, right? There's variety among this population of bacteria that's living in you. And when you first take that antibiotics, you're killing off all the weak ones, but some of them might be resistant to it. And it might take more to kill them because they're stronger, right? There's something in their genome that makes them stronger. And if you don't finish your antibiotics and kill them, then those are the ones that are going to reproduce. And the secondary infection that you have is going to be worse, right? Because that population of bacteria is resistant to the round of antibiotics that you just had. Anyway, any questions about that idea of pesticide resistance or antibiotic resistance? Okay, let's talk about some key points of natural selection. This is important. I love to point this out. This is very important. Natural selection is more of an editing process than a creative mechanism, right? It's not like nature's planning something, right? There was no planning. And again, I use this lab for an example, the peppered moth lab. I know sometimes people use the term that on one of those last questions, they say, yeah, because of the predators that the moths decided they needed to change colors. They didn't decide anything, right? Some of them just happened to be black, some of them happened to be white, and it just so happened the black ones in that case had an advantage. So that's what this is. It's not a creative mechanism. This is not decision making. It's just nature, right? Some things are going to make it, some things are not going to make it. Also, we can only amplify or diminish heritable traits. It cannot create them. So natural selection did not create that first black moth, for example, right? That was random, right? It's a completely random mutation, and then we happen to have a black moth. Natural selection, again, it wasn't as if the moth population was like, oh man, we're in trouble. We're white, and everything is now turned dark thanks to all this smoke. So we need to change things up. No, it didn't happen that way, right? It's completely random. Anyway, second bullet point here, organisms can acquire characteristics that help it survive, but acquired characteristics cannot be passed on to an offspring. So again, using the soot as an example. Not that I've read anything that ever said this happened, but let's assume we had a white moth that was covered by soot. It would have an advantage, right? That would be an acquired characteristic, right? It turned black because of the smoke, assuming that ever happened. But when and if that thing reproduces, it's not passing along that trait, right? Because it wasn't genetic, that was an acquired characteristic. And in a sense, this is kind of like the opposite of what Lamarck thought, right? Because again, Lamarck, I don't know if you remember us talking about him before we really started talking about Darwin, and I used giraffes as an example. He thought they had long necks because they spent their whole lives stretching their neck, right? So that made them a little bit longer. And then when they passed on, when they reproduced, they passed along the fact they had been stretching their necks, right? So he was saying he thought that acquired characteristic was passed along. But we know now that's not how it works. Questions about that side? So again, natural selection is not goal-directed. This is very important to understand. It doesn't lead to perfectly adapted organisms. We are a great example of that, right? Everyone just thinks humans is the top species or whatever, but we have so many flaws, and you can look into them for extra credit if you want. One of them we've already talked about. We have the gene to make vitamin C, our own vitamin C, like almost every other mammal on Earth, but our gene is broken. So we can't, so we have to eat it. That is a disadvantage. You might not think it's a disadvantage. You can just run the Kroger and buy some lemons or some oranges or whatever, but it is a disadvantage in nature. There's other things too. Think about this. Whales, as weird as it might seem, they breathe out of one hole and eat out of another. That's a better design than what we have. Eating and drinking and breathing out of the same hole is dangerous. People die. People choke very often because of this reason, right? So if we were perfectly adapted, we probably wouldn't have those in the same hole. Granted, I don't want a blowhole in the back of my neck, but still, as far as survival is concerned, I would be more likely to survive, right? Anyway, some other things to consider. Is it a trait that's favorable in one situation, maybe useless, or even detrimental in different circumstances? So again, think about the peppered moths. At one point, it was beneficial to be a white moth, right? Before the Industrial Revolution, they fit in with the trees, right? They blended in with the trees because they were kind of white and peppered, and they looked a little bit like lichen, that stuff that grows on the trees, so they could fit in. But then all of a sudden, when things started getting dark because of the Industrial Revolution, that thing that used to help them survive then was a disadvantage, right? It was made them more likely to die. So things changes. Excuse me, things change. So another example of that, even though I'm not going to ask you any questions, I'm not going to ask you any questions about these examples, the finches, right? So we talked about those finches that Darwin studied earlier. Basically, they have certain beaks that allow them to eat different things. And when the environment is doing one thing, and I don't know, maybe because of the way the environment is for a few years, there's a lot of fruit, right? So maybe there's a beak that's particularly adapted to fruit. But then maybe there's a drought for 5 years. So now there's less fruit and there's more, I don't know, insects, whatever it may be. And then there's a different beak adapted for that, right? So again, you might have one thing may be advantageous at one point, but then things change and it's no longer an advantage. Let's see. You know what? Now we won't do the next word yet. I'll keep moving. Let's talk about the evolution of populations. This is big. It's going to be a lot of information. And if anything, before we even get into this, that's a very important point for the exam. The evolution of populations. That's definitely going to be a test question. I definitely want you to understand that. Populations evolve. Individuals do not evolve. No individual evolves. We talked about adaptations earlier and acquired characteristics, right? Individuals might acquire characteristics, but individuals do not evolve, right? So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the evolution of populations. Darwin will be the next word for attendance. Anyway, Darwin did not know how the variations that are the raw material for natural selection arise in a population. So again, he already figured out that this variation was the key to natural selection, right? Because nature has to have something to choose, like choose this over that, right? One thing has to be advantageous, one thing has to be disadvantageous, right? You need that variation. He knew that, but he didn't know where it came from, right? He didn't know anything about mutations. No one knew about mutations yet. And he also didn't know how these variations were passed along, right? So basically what we're saying here is he didn't know genetics. And most people didn't know genetics, right? Mendel did at this, around the same time period. Mendel was figuring that out. The one thing I didn't mention about Mendel when we talked about it is it wasn't like Darwin where his work came out and everyone was like, oh, wow, we know genetics now. If I remember correctly, it was he went unknown, basically. He wasn't known until I think it was after his death when someone's like, oh man, this is important work. But not that that's important for the exam, just want to let you know. So yeah, again, Darwin knew variation was a key. He didn't know anything about mutations. He didn't know anything about genetics. No one else did either, for the most part, other than the fact that Mendel had figured out a lot about genetics, as you know. So let's start talking about this. Some of these concepts should be not new to you. They should be reminders, right? So this idea of variation, right? We've talked about it a lot in this chapter. We've talked about it before. Individual variation occurs in all species, right? Every species. So even something as simple as bacteria, we might not be able to see it. So if you just look at bacteria under a microscope, you might not be able to tell the difference between this organism and that organism. But they're there, right? There is definitely a difference. Sometimes it's an obvious physical difference, right? Like that's why I have all these pictures. Of course, it's kind of blurry, but picture of all these different faces, right? It's easy for us humans look at other humans and you can see even just faces, right? That person's definitely different than this person. Sometimes it is obvious. But again, sometimes it's not so obvious. Sometimes this phenotypic variation is only at the molecular level. But again, the point here is there is variation. Every population, right, every species has variation. But again, I know I'm repeating myself here. That's hopefully that'll help you when the exam comes. Not all variation is heritable. Right? So again, if it's not heritable, it does not matter as far as natural selection is concerned. It's only the genetic component of variation that is relevant to natural selection. So, any questions about this slide? Okay, here's a picture from the old textbook. This is a great example. These are all the same species of snakes. These are garter snakes. And you can see, of course, it's really blurry. This is why I ask people to turn the projector off when they're not using it, because it turns out like this. But anyway, if you could see it, you could download the PowerPoint and look at it if you want. But those snakes have very different colors, very different looks, even though they are the same species, right? This is one population of snakes with all this variation. So where does this variation come from? You already know this, but we're going to talk about it again. So when we first started talking about mutations, I told you we're going to talk about this again when we talk about evolution and natural selection. So here we are. We're talking about it right now. New alleles originate by mutation. And just so you already know, even though you already know, we'll say it again what a mutation is. It's the change in the nucleotide sequence of the DNA, right? So sometimes you have an A, you swap it for a T, perhaps, right? We talked about substitutions, insertions, deletions, right? So you know, basically you're just changing the code. When you change the code, more often than not, then you change the amino acid that it codes for. And when you do that, you change the protein. And when you do that, you change the function of that protein. And when you do that, you change the organism, right? So that will definitely be a test question, this bullet point right here. The ultimate source of genetic variation that serves as raw material for evolution is mutations. You need to know that. In multicellular organisms, it's only the mutations that produce in the cells that produce gametes that matter, right? So, you know, you could get, I don't know, sunburn really badly on your shoulders, and then that mutates the DNA and those skin cells, and then you get skin cancer, right? But that's not going to pass unless it metastasizes and spreads to your reproductive organs. Then that's not going to affect your offspring, right? You could have skin cancer and still have offspring that don't have cancer, right? It's the mutations. Mutations have to be involved with the gametes. That's also important to make sure you know that, right? So not just any old mutation. It has to be a mutation. Again, like we keep saying, it has to be heritable, right? So in this case, that's what we're talking about, right? That mutation has to be in the reproductive area. It has to be passed along. And again, we're talking about multicellular organisms here. If you're single celled, you know, you only have one cell, therefore any mutation is going to be passed along when you go through mitosis. Or meiosis, actually, yeah, or however you reproduce. Any questions so far? All right, so again, we're still talking about mutations. Hopefully this is nothing new to you. Hopefully this is just a refresher from what we talked about previously. A change as small as a single nucleotide in a gene can have a significant effect, right? We talked about sickle cell before, talking about it again, right? So that, you know, just one letter, we change one letter out of that entire gene, and that gives you this whole disease of sickle cell. So this is, again, these mutations can be a big deal. But it's important to note that random changes in an organism's DNA are not likely to improve its genome any more than randomly changing some words on the page, right? So it does happen, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't have natural selection, right? Again, going back to the peppered moths, that random change happened to be good. It just happened to produce a dark moth, which just happened to be beneficial at that time. So it can help. And using sickle cells as an example too, let's talk about that, even though I'm not going to ask you any questions about it on the exam. But does anybody know which population on Earth of humans, which group of humans is more likely to have sickle cell? With race, how about that? Anybody know? People of African descent are more likely to have sickle cell. Like they have it in higher numbers. And the reason is, even though it's a disease, it actually does provide an advantage, especially did. So I'll give you an example. So you can look at the sickle cell here. This is what a sickle cell looks like, right? And again, I wish this projector looked better. But here's a bunch of healthy red blood cells. And then here's two that have been infected with malaria. And with malaria, what happens is there's a parasite that lives inside your blood cell that reproduces in there until the blood cell explodes, as you can see in that picture. And then those parasites go to the next blood cell and infect it, and the infection continues. But that won't work with sickle cell. Like sickle cells is hard. The malaria parasite cannot infect a sickle cell blood cell. So even though it's a disease and has its disadvantages, In sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a lot of mosquitoes carrying malaria, that actually was a benefit. So yes, you were diseased, but you were still, because you had that sickle cell, you were still more likely to survive, therefore more likely to reproduce, therefore more likely to pass along that gene, that mutation. You can look up other ones. There's other examples too. Like look into lactose, right? There's certain groups of humans who are lactose intolerant more than others. There's a reason for that. You can look into it for extra credit. Anyway, a mutation that affects a protein's function will probably be harmful. So again, not always, but probably, right? So again, not always. And I've already gave you one example of that, which is sickle cell. I'm trying to remember why I had that guy on there, what the example was. Oh yeah. And this kind of goes back to something we were talking about earlier about how sometimes one thing could be advantageous and then turn disadvantageous, or vice versa. And like, let's say this guy is a large fella, right? Even larger than I am. Let's say there's something wrong with his genome, and maybe like, I don't know if you want to say it's wrong, but anyway, maybe he's just really efficient at metabolism. So remember, here's a number that you need to know for the final exam to remind you from a previous exam. When you eat, excuse me, 34% of that energy is put to work, right? The rest of it is just basically lost as heat. But let's say he has something wrong with his genome, where when he eats, 80% of those calories are put to work, right? His cells use them, 80%. Now that's a number I'm making up. You don't need to know that, another 34%. So that alarm, maybe he just eats healthy and he works out and whatever, but that's how he looks because his body is keeping all of those calories, right? Because his cells are very efficient. And that would be disadvantageous, right? It's not healthy to be like me and him, right? It's not healthy to be fat. But, World War III happens and we go to nuclear winter and, 85% of the human population dies and it's just a few people trying to survive and there's hardly anything to eat. All of a sudden, this guy has an advantage because he does not need to eat as much as everybody else because he actually keeps those calories that he eats. He keeps more of them than other people. Therefore, he's more likely not to starve to death. Therefore, he's more likely to reproduce and pass along those genes, and then his offspring would have that mutation. Anyway, all those are all examples. Any questions? All right. So again, more about mutations, and hopefully this is just a reminder of what we've already talked about. Chromosomal mutations that delete, disrupt, or rearrange many gene loci at once. So, big chunks of the chromosome, basically what I'm saying. That's more likely to be harmful, right? So small changes. Excuse me. Make sure we're still recording. Try to kick us out. Anyway, basically what we're saying here, not that I'm going to ask you this on the exam, but when we're talking about mutations, again, usually they're bad, sometimes they're good. Talking about big mutations, usually those even more so are bad, right? So the probability of a big mutation being beneficial is even smaller. But sometimes a duplication of a gene or small pieces of DNA can provide important sources of genetic variation and eventually lead to new genes with novel functions, right? So again, sometimes these big mutations just lead to completely new proteins, and sometimes those completely new proteins are actually beneficial. And again, there's some great human examples of this. You can look it up for extra credit. Look up some big mutations that humans have had that have changed them. And that includes, of course, in that conversation, that also includes deletions, right? So look up like where some genes have just been deleted or duplicated. We have some genes in our genome where we have more than one of them. And it's actually made some big changes. Look up like eyesight, things like that. Anyway, any questions about this slide? Okay. So mostly what we've been talking about has been eukaryotes, but real quickly we'll talk about prokaryotes because it's slightly different, right? In prokaryotes, mutations quickly generate genetic variation. Because again, prokaryotes are single-celled, right? So, and they're haploid, right? So when that single-celled organism has a mutation, they have that one chromosome. So if it has a mutation and it goes through mitosis, that's going to get copied, right? It'll be passed down to its the two new daughter cells, right? That's how that works. But that's not like it is for us, right? Like we already mentioned, for us to pass down a mutation, it has to be in our reproductive organs, right? We need to produce the gametes that have those mutations. And not only that, but we're diploid, right? We're diploid. We don't have only one chromosome. We have two of each.
Remember, they get segregated when you go through meiosis. So when you look at any given gamete, unless something went wrong, it only has one or the other of each homologous chromosome, or one or the other. Another way of saying this is one or the other of the allele, right? Either the allele from your mom or the allele from your dad. So even if your mom, for example, passed along some mutated gene to you, when you reproduce and you produce your gametes, there's a 50% chance that you're going to pass along that mutation and a 50% chance that you will not, right? Because there's a 50% chance that the gamete that gets, that gets used will have that mutation that came from your mom, and then a 50% chance that gamete came from your dad, or excuse me, that allele in the gamete came from your dad. So even though we're kind of beating a dead horse here, this is a good, I like this, it's a good little refresher course to remind you of some stuff that you're going to need to know for the final exam. So speaking of which, so like I said, prokaryotes, these mutations, once they have them, they pass along, it's getting perfectly copied in mitosis. So the changes happen quickly with prokaryotes. In plants and animals, there's an average of one mutation in every 100,000 genes per generation, an average. So that means, like for you, for our generation, obviously there's more than, we need more than one person to have 100,000 genes. But if you were to look at the entire population and look at the genome, yeah, for every 100,000 genes, every generation is about one mutation. But put next to this, I'm not going to ask you that on the exam. That's not a number that you need to know. So that's one of the reasons, right? That first of all, the mutations don't happen that often. Also, generally speaking, compared to prokaryotes, animals and plants have a long life, a long span between generations, right? And this whole time we've been sitting here, that's been long enough for a bacteria to reproduce, right? Generally speaking, plants and animals don't do that. And again, like we already mentioned, plants and animals have diploid genomes. Also, the same can be said for fungi. I don't know why the textbook didn't mention that, but they didn't. Any questions about that? All right, the next word for attendance is where I have that X, is average. Average is the next word for attendance. All right, let's really quickly talk about sexual reproduction. Again, a lot of this, you should already know this from previous chapters. We're just kind of talking about it in a different context. But again, this is good because it'll help you remember some things that you're going to need to know for the final exam. For sexually reproducing organisms, that's what it should say, most genetic variation in a population from a unique combination of alleles, or most of the variation comes from the unique combination of alleles that you get, right? Because they get reshuffled. Now, you already learned about crossing over and independent, law of segregation, right? Independent assortment. We learned about all that, right? So we basically reshuffling everything. So because of that, we have a fresh assortment of existing alleles that arise every generation, right? From those three things. Oh yeah, and random fertilization. I forgot to mention that. Okay, so remember when we talked about independent assortment, that was the big one, right? As we said, you've got 23 pairs of chromosomes, and when they line up in the middle of the cell during meiosis, it's not like all mom chromosomes are on one side and all dad chromosomes are on the other, right? It's completely random. Remember, we said because of that, if you were to look at 8 million, different sperm or egg in your body, each one of them will have a different set of chromosomes, right? When it comes to, who got, was chromosome number 1 from your mom or your dad? Was chromosome number 2 from your mom or your dad? All the way down to the sex chromosomes, right? So 8 million different combinations. And then remember, we said when you combine that with the idea that also for the other gamete, there's 8 million. So then the chances of that gamete, that egg, and that sperm coming together, I think we said was 64 trillion. And that, again, doesn't even include crossing over. So yeah, you have all these different variations of which chromosome is in which gamete, but then you have crossing over. So yeah, chromosome number 1, yes, you may have gotten it from your mom, but now it's got a small chunk of dad on it. But that one gamete. For the other gamete, maybe it's entirely from your mom. From the other gamete, maybe it's entirely from your dad. Right? So all this is where we get this variation from. So any questions about that? Again, this is a refresher. You guys already knew all this. We're just saying it. We're talking about it in a different context. So the evolutionary impact of natural selection is only apparent in the changes of populations. Said that before, I'm saying it again, that will definitely be a test question. It's very important. Again, individuals do not evolve, right? Natural selection does not make an individual change. And an individual might change, but that would be an acquired characteristic. When we're talking about natural selection, it's only populations that change. So to remind you what a population is, and you need to know this for the exam, it's a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. And then later in the semester, I'm going to give you a different definition of a population. It's basically the same thing, but it's focused on something different because we'll be having a different conversation at that point. But yeah, we're talking about the same species, right? So they have to be in the same area because they have to be able to interbreed. And also, even though it's not written down here, we'll talk about it later in the semester, they need to be dealing with the same environmental conditions. Right? So that's what a population is. Make sure you know what a population is. So different populations of the same species may be geographically isolated. So try not to think about humans. Humans are so different, right? We think of the entire human population as we should, because potentially, for the most part, the entire human population could interbreed, right? We have planes, we have boats and vehicles. We can get from one place to another. So in theory, for the most part, humans, the entire human population, can all interbreed. But this is not the way it is for everything, right? For most things, it's not like that. They could be geographically isolated from each other. We talked about that at the very beginning of the chapter, right? Where we talked about allopatric speciation, right? Where these populations are separated from each other. And at first they're the same species, but because they have these different things that they're going through, these different environmental conditions, they start changing. Anyway, because they're geographically isolated from each other, the exchange of genetic material rarely happens, or sometimes never happens. And again, this is where we get isopatric speciation, excuse me. Allopatric speciation. Yeah, sorry. Here's a good example, right? Here's a picture. Again, I wish you could see it better. Imagine this, right? Hopefully you can see that there's a bunch of little lakes, or excuse me, a bunch of lakes. They're different sizes, different shapes. And you can imagine there's different environments, right? Maybe one of them's really deep and has colder, less oxygenated water. Maybe one of them's more shallow and has warmer, more oxygenated water, right? Maybe you have different predators living in this lake versus that lake. Maybe there's different nutrients in these lakes, right? So they're different environments. You might just think, oh, it's a lake. A lake is a lake, but they're not, right? They're all different. But imagine before we had all these different lakes, imagine this used to be one big lake. And you just had one species of fish, for example. And then the water level went down. And now that one species of fish, now we have different populations, right? We have a population here, 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 and here, and here. And for the most part, those fish are not going to interbreed, right? Maybe somebody goes fishing, does a little catch and release, and for some reason releases it to the other lake. Maybe a bird goes in and catches a fish here and is trying to fly away to eat it and accidentally drops it there. Sure, but for the most part, they're not exchanging genetic information. And this is how we have speciation, right? They get geographically isolated. They're in different environments, and they adapt accordingly. So the population level biologists focus on something called a gene pool. I'm sure you've heard this term before. You need to know what it is for the example. The gene pool consists of all copies of every type of allele in every locus in all members of the population. So in a sense, we already know what a genome is, right? Your genome is all of your DNA, right? It's every single letter, every single nucleotide in your DNA. But a gene pool is not just it's like your genome plus everyone else's genome, right? That's what a gene pool is. In the picture, it's Gene Belcher from Bob's Burger, and they're in a pool. Anyway, imagine a wildfire. Well, here we go. Sorry. Let's talk about analyzing gene pools. We got 3 minutes left. Let's just be done in 3 minutes early. And when we get back, we'll talk about stuff you already know because you already did the Hardy-Weinberg lab, but that's what we're about to talk about is analyzing gene pools. And that's what we're going to the last word for attendance day will be flowers. And again, if you're doing it, you're sitting in those words, don't forget to ask one question about the material. And if you're watching the video, you're going to like or comment on the video and screenshot that. That's it. You guys have a great week. I'll be in my office and online for office hours if you need me. And I'll see you on Wednesday for lecture, not lab. Unless you need my help for that, then I'll be there for you.